Hello, I am Professor Frank Rudy Cooper. I am a William S. Boyd Professor of Law and Director of the Program on Race, Gender, and Policing at the William S. Boyd School of Law at UNLV. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing my friend and distinguished colleague, Professor Ruben Garcia. Professor Garcia is the Ralph Denton Professor of Law and Director of the Workplace Law Program at the William S. Boyd School of Law at UNLV. So, Ruben.
Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. So I think the best way for us to go is to talk a little bit about sort of biography, how you got into this, then to talk a little bit about theory, and then to talk about sort of what does this mean for today? So just biography-wise, I was wondering, what were your experiences with labor as a teenager?
Well, it's interesting, actually. I didn't know that I was going to be a labor law professor when I was 12, but things happened to me when I was younger that really affected, I think, the rest of my life and the rest of my career. My father, who had worked for a retail store for 37 years, all of a sudden, terminated, and it really caused me to wonder about sort of why that happened and what could be done about it. So obviously I didn't, at that moment think that I was going to be a labor lawyer, but that's actually what happened. I went to college and law school and became a labor lawyer in Southern California. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I was so glad to do that for several years and to finally kind of see kind of how the law did and did not remedy all of the problems of the workplace. So it really encouraged me to want to continue thinking about that and working on that as a career. And so that's what led me into academia and kind of what led the seeds or laid the seeds for writing a couple of books on the subject of workplace law. One in 2012 called Marginal Workers, and one that just came out in this year called Critical Wage Theory.
All right, so we're going to talk about critical wage theory in a moment, but I'm just wondering, sort of, you worked as a labor lawyer. What's maybe like your favorite case or most interesting case?
Oh, gosh, well, so I worked for unions and employees. And some of the most important cases to me were those that I did for immigrant workers and workers who were, had immigration issues, but were also denied wages that they were owed or fired because they tried to organize a union. And those cases really, I think, of course, affected the rest of my interest in the subject of labor and employment law, but also, again, the ways in which a lot of these cases were really the intersection and the confluence of different problems going on in society. One, of course, the way that immigrants are treated generally in society. Another is just for all workers, the ineffectiveness sometimes of legal remedies. And then the third is really the intersection or the interaction of all of those things, especially when you're talking about workers of color who are also the victims of wage theft and discrimination.
Okay, so that makes me think, from having read the book, about the way you define critical wage theory. What is critical wage theory?
Well, it's really, my intellectual upbringing, right? Okay. Critical race theory, I was fortunate enough to study with some of the great critical race theorists in the country in law school, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Laura Gomez, Devin Carbato. I was very fortunate to be learning from them in terms of their approaches to the way that law both reinstitutes various hierarchies of racism within society, but also has the potential, when examined, to try to correct some of those imbalances and correct those hierarchies. So that really, really influenced the rest of my scholarly trajectory, after law school, and of course my practice as well. And critical wage theory is really the idea that the intersection of a lot of these statuses, like race, national origin, immigration, compound or really are compounding a lot of the income inequality and economic inequality that is going on in society. And also that, again, the law doesn't take enough account of intersecting identities and the interaction of a lot of these problems because it's very siloed, right? So Professor Crenshaw, obviously wrote importantly and forcefully on the ways in which employment discrimination law doesn't really take into account the issues and the needs of black women.
Right, which is the birth of intersectionality theory,
yes.
That idea that when you have the intersection of race and gender, it creates a compound and unique identity, and then having that unique identity formed at the intersection means that law operates differently than it otherwise might. I love the fact that you're taking that insight, right, like how being black and a woman affects your employment, and saying instead, well, what if you are a person of color, and then you're having other sorts of intersecting identities, like being a marginal worker.
Mm-hmm. Right? Or being an immigrant worker, or being a low-wage worker, right? So again, there could be a number of different statuses that are, again, compounding the existing problems of people not getting paid for the work they're done, or being discriminated against on the job. And that's really the cases that I did. You know, that really showed me the intersection and the interaction of all of these things, you know, because again, I was working for construction workers who weren't paid properly, and because they were immigrant workers, they were underpaid. When they tried to organize for their wages, they were terminated. And so all of those things, again, led me to pretty much the rest of my career focused on immigrant workers, low-wage workers, and the lack of interaction between the statutes that are supposed to protect them, minimum wage, overtime, anti-discrimination laws, and labor laws.
Okay, so then let's focus then on like the minimum wage. That's very important to you. Why is it so important? And you know, does our current system have it right?
Well, it's a great question because you know, obviously, trying to construct a theory that takes into account the needs of the most marginalized workers at the bottom of the income scale is something, again, that is normatively very important for me, and I think very important to critical race theory and outsider jurisprudence. And that's, again, that's lat crit theory and other theories that I was really brought up in. And so that is why I focus on obviously raising the minimum wage and ensuring that workers who are supposed to get it are getting it. Okay. And that is, you know, as a matter of both personal and professional, you know, importance is something that I've worked on for a long time.
All right, so the minimum wage is one thing that we need to focus on. And then in addition to that, we need to focus on, it sounds like, wage theft.
Exactly. Those workers who are supposed to get a certain level of wages who are not getting that, or misclassified as independent contractors when they really are employees, or you know, again, hours that they were supposed to be paid for that they weren't, being shaved off the top, or simply just race discrimination, right? You know, not paying certain workers because of their race or their immigration status, right? That is the kind of thing that has interested me for a long time. And I was really glad to be able to kind of put it all in one place, but also try to look ahead, right? To look forward in terms of, is the system that we have really serving marginalized workers, workers of color? You know, what could be done to improve the system that we have in order to make sure that the laws are working for everybody? And of course, all boats are lifted up, because if we lift up the bottom and focus on the lowest paid among us, then the idea is that that will lift up the boats of all throughout the scale of workers who are, you know, also
lifts all boats.
Yes, who are also being affected by discrimination or underpayment of wages, or wage inequality, or equal pay problems.
Okay, so there's a lot in there to unpack. And I guess what I wonder now is, okay, so in this current environment, we've obviously got a very significant presidential campaign going on with people who have some ideas in common and then some ideas that are different. Let's talk about one that they seem to have in common, the elimination of taxes on tips. How does your critical wage theory analyze a question like that?
Well, that's another great question, and it's interesting that that has become a big issue, particularly here in Nevada, that it's really been focused on and important for the election here in Nevada, right? So I think, you know, the tipped worker issue is something that I focus on in the book, and it is something that I've watched for many years, of course, the movement around dealing with tipped workers, right? So there is a social movement in this country to eliminate all these exemptions and tiers that make some minimum wage workers paid, very low wages and essentially forced to make up their wages in tips. Actually, it's not just servers and restaurant workers. It's also people who are expected to make their entire pay by tips. Even exotic dancers who are required to work for tips and actually required to pay in order to work. Those are some of the most egregious cases of wage theft that have been dealt with in the courts, right? And yet the tipped worker issue, of course, as a question of tax on tips, eliminates or obviates the need to talk about raising the wage for all workers, right? And that's one of the unfortunate things about this proposal, is that regardless of how you feel about it as a tax proposal, it is not a proposal to really deal with low-wage workers and misclassification, right? So obviously, if I was, going to advise the candidates, I would, of course, argue for a higher minimum wage, right? And to raise the minimum wage. That has been, and really the reason that I wrote this book is to try to deal with this paradox of a public policy that is widely popular with all kinds of different voters. Red states, blue states have all raised their wages. Now more than 20 states, have raised their minimum wage in the last 10 years. Okay. And yet the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour for the last 15 years. Right? And that is really the paradox that really caused me to write this book, right? And I have to conclude that at the end of the day, a lot of it is about feeling that having a stratum of workers that are often people of color, often immigrants, that are just expected to work for less, right? And it's the same with restaurant workers and the tipping issue. To have some workers in some states being paid as little as $2.13 from the employer, right? And as a result of this inequality and the racial histories of that inequality is the reason I wrote this book, is to talk about that and put it in a larger historical context, and also show that the movements that are asking for a higher minimum wage, an elimination of the tipped wage, are actually putting it in terms of racial justice. And that's why the subtitle of the book is Why Wage Justice is Racial Justice, is to show that is a frame that can make sense for a higher minimum wage and better enforcement of the minimum wage.
That's great. So maybe we can bring this home by just asking, so given this critical wage approach, we talked about the taxes on tips. Is there one other issue that you wish the presidential candidates or other policymakers would be looking at?
Well, again, I have limited hopes for the presidential campaign looking at issues very deeply. Obviously, raising the minimum wage is a relatively low-hanging fruit as a policy matter, at least in terms of we know what it could be, right? And we don't have to go through a lot of study in terms of designing a whole new system. But in the book, I basically argue for getting away from this hourly minimum wage to looking more towards a minimum salary. Many of us are familiar with living on a salary because of the predictability and sort of stability that it gives us. And a lot of low-wage workers don't have that kind of stability. And they're getting hours here and there at different jobs. And so a deep dive or a longer-term kind of project of mine is to continue looking at ways to design a system that provides more stability and security to low-wage workers than the hourly wage has, right? And so that is something, again, that maybe not in this presidential campaign or this year we can really get done, but maybe down the line, much more into the future, looking at redesigning the workplace to make it more amenable to people having a living wage and a reasonable life, that is not so insecure and unstable.
Thank you so much, Ruben.
Thank you.
So thank you to the audience for listening to this. The book, again, is called Critical Wage Theory by Ruben Garcia. And if you want to find out more about the UNLV Boyd School of Law, please go to law.unlv.edu. Thank you.